Right now, as you're watching this, Death Valley is forecast to hit 126 degrees Fahrenheit. Phoenix, Tucson, and Las Vegas are all running well above 110. And forecasters expect roughly 10% of the entire continental United States to log its hottest day of the whole year by tomorrow. At the exact same moment, on the other side of the Atlantic, a fourth major. Heat dome of the season is locking into place over Europe, with peak temperatures forecast to reach 42 to 46 degrees Celsius across Spain and Portugal within days. This is not a coincidence of timing. CNN's own weather desk described this exact stretch as the latest in a string of record-breaking heat waves that have hit the United States and Europe simultaneously, again for roughly the fourth time since this summer began. In Maricopa County, Arizona alone, 40 heat-related deaths have already been confirmed this year, and a separate tally by the Washington Post counted at least 70 deaths tied specifically to July's heat domes, a number that outpaces the individual state. By state counts, most people have actually seen reported. This is the story of why the same locking, stalling atmospheric pattern keeps reappearing on both sides of the same ocean at the same time, sourced directly from this week's official forecasts, and the meteorologists tracking the pattern in real time, not recycled headlines. Drop a comment and tell me if you are under one of these heat alerts right now in the United States or in Europe, because a genuinely unusual number of you are dealing with the same sky at the same time. If you want grounded weather coverage instead of a scary headline with nothing behind it, subscribe. It is free. And a like helps this reach the people who need to see this today. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. Both of these heat waves, thousands of miles apart, are being produced by the exact same atmospheric mechanism, a blocking pattern called an omega block, named for the shape it traces across a weather map when the jet stream buckles into a tall ridge of high. Pressure flanked by two areas of low pressure on either side. Underneath that ridge, air sinks instead of moving through, and as it sinks, it compresses and heats further, while also suppressing the cloud cover that would otherwise offer any relief from direct sun. Over the United States this week, that ridge has parked itself over the southwest and central plains, with a strong upper-level pattern locking peak afternoon temperatures into the 105 to 120 degree range from the desert, southwest through the northern high plains and into southern Canada. Over Europe, a nearly identical structure, described by forecasters as a textbook omega block with a high-pressure core flanked by lows over the North Atlantic and Russia, is driving what meteorologists are calling the season's fourth major heat wave, pulling hot, dry air up from North Africa and pushing it across Iberia, France, and eventually Central Europe and the Balkans, with the ridge itself expected to remain locked in place for close to 2 weeks once fully established. Tracing this pattern back across the summer shows just how often this specific setup has repeated itself. Europe's first heat wave arrived in late May, breaking all-time springtime heat records across the continent. Its second major event struck in late June, an omega block that held North African heat over more than a dozen countries simultaneously, and has since been tied to a preliminary estimate of more than 20,000 deaths across the continent in just the worst single week alone. A third heat wave followed in mid-July. Now, as this video goes, the fourth has arrived, forecast to push peak temperatures past 45 degrees Celsius in the most exposed lowlands of Spain and Portugal. The United States has followed an almost parallel rhythm. A slow, moving heat dome sizzled the eastern half of the country in early July, toppling records across multiple states. Another dome then spiked temperatures to 115 degrees in Montana, setting Billings' all-time hottest temperature on record at 111 degrees just 2 weeks before this current event. And now, this week's dome, described by the meteorologist tracking it for the Washington Post as the strongest on the planet at the moment it formed, is pushing straight through the Rockies and Plains toward the west coast. The reason these patterns keep showing up together, rather than as isolated, unrelated hot spells, comes down to research climate scientists have been building for more than a decade on something called planetary wave resonance. Researchers including Kai Kornhuber and Stefan Rahmstorf at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research have shown that when the jet stream circling the northern hemisphere locks into specific wave patterns, particularly configurations known as wave 5 and wave 7, the meandering itself becomes anchored in place rather than moving weather systems through in the usual few days, and that anchoring can raise the odds of simultaneous heat extremes across widely separated regions, in some cases by a factor of up to 20 for the most severe events. The research has also found that this specific kind of locked, resonant wave pattern has become measurably more frequent over the past several decades, tied to the same Arctic warming that has been shrinking the temperature difference between the pole and the mid-latitudes, the very difference that normally keeps the jet stream moving in a relatively straight, fast line instead of buckling into these stalled formations that can sit over the same geography for a week or more at a time. None of this means every heat dome on one continent directly causes a heat dome on another. It means the same underlying atmospheric conditions that make one likely tend to make the other likely too, which is precisely why forecasters have stopped treating these events as unrelated coincidences and started describing them as connected expressions of the same season-L pattern, one that has now shown up in some form on both continents at least 4 separate times since the season began. The human cost of this repeating pattern has been considerable on both sides of the ocean, and it has fallen hardest on people already vulnerable to extreme heat. In Maricopa County, home to Phoenix, 40 confirmed heat-related deaths have been recorded so far this year, with months of summer heat still ahead. The broader Washington Post analysis found at least 70 deaths tied specifically to July's heat domes nationally, a toll that outpaces the more limited counts individual states have reported on their own. In Los Angeles County, lifeguards performed nearly 2,000 ocean rescues in a single week as millions sought relief at the beach, even as offshore hurricane activity added dangerous rip currents on top of the heat itself. In Europe, overnight low temperatures have become almost as dangerous as the daytime peaks, with so-called tropical nights, when the temperature never drops below 20 degrees Celsius, denying the human body its usual overnight window to recover, a pattern forecasters say is compounding physiological stress for millions of residents, even in regions where the daytime heat itself has been survivable, particularly for elderly residents living in homes built decades ago without any meaningful cooling system. Canada has been caught in the same broad pattern as well, even though its own crisis has looked different on the surface. The same upper-level ridge-locking heat over the American Southwest and Central Plains this week extends its reach into southern Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the same heat that primed Ontario's vegetation for the wildfire outbreak earlier this summer traces back to an earlier instance of this exact ridge pattern sitting in almost the same place. Nearly 280 million Americans have experienced above average or well above average temperatures since June, according to seasonal tracking, while just 2.8 million people nationally, mostly in pockets of coastal California, Montana, and western Texas, actually experience cooler than average conditions over that same stretch. That imbalance, the overwhelming majority of an entire country sitting on the hot side of the pattern while only a tiny sliver sits on the cool side, is itself a signal of how dominant this particular atmospheric configuration has become this year compared to a more typical summer where hot and cool stretches would usually be spread more evenly across the map. There is a meaningful difference in how different places have handled this repeating pattern, and it says something worth sitting with. Regions that maintain active cooling center networks, issue heat alerts early, and have built housing designed to shed heat rather than trap it have generally weathered even the most extreme individual days of this pattern without mass casualty events. Regions relying on older infrastructure, whether that means homes built for a cooler climate decades ago in parts of Europe, or communities in the American Southwest without reliable access to air conditioning, have consistently produced the more serious outcomes almost regardless of which specific heat dome or heat wave number is actually responsible. The pattern itself may be atmospheric. The outcome, in nearly every case researchers have studied, comes down to what was built and prepared for before the heat arrived. So what does this actually mean for you, wherever you happen to be watching this from? If you live anywhere in the American Southwest or Central Plains right now, the practical reality is that this heat dome is expected to remain locked in place for multiple more days before shifting toward the West Coast, meaning the heat alerts currently in effect are not a short-term inconvenience. If you live in Western or Central Europe, the same logic applies to the heat wave now, building toward its peak later this week. In both cases, the single most useful habit sitting inside everything we just walked through is treating overnight heat as seriously as daytime heat, since it is increasingly the lack of overnight relief, not just the peak afternoon number, that is driving the worst outcomes from this pattern. The honest, grounded summary is this. The United States and Europe are once again locked under matching heat dome patterns at the same time, the fourth such alignment of this kind this summer alone, driven by the same omega block mechanism and increasingly linked by scientists to a well-documented pattern of planetary wave resonance that has grown more frequent as the Arctic warms faster than the rest of the planet. Death Valley is forecast to reach 126 degrees this week, while Spain and Portugal brace for peaks near 46 degrees Celsius, and the human toll on both continents, from Maricopa County's 40 confirmed deaths to Europe's preliminary estimate of more than 20,000 from a single week in June, reflects a summer where this exact pattern has stopped being the exception and started becoming the season's defining feature. We are going to keep tracking this as the pattern continues to cycle through the rest of the summer, sourced the same way we did today, straight from the National Weather Service, the researchers actually studying planetary wave resonance, and the meteorologists explaining the mechanism rather than just posting a scary number, not recycled headlines. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one, because based on this summer's own rhythm, it is very likely to happen again. And leave that comment below. Tell me where you are watching from, and whether this is the first heat dome you have lived through this summer, or like so many people right now, the third or fourth. Because behind every one of these numbers is a lifeguard in Los Angeles who has pulled nearly 2,000 people out of the water in a single week, a family in Maricopa County that has become one of 40 this year, someone in Portugal checking the forecast for a heat wave with a number attached to it that most residents never expected to need to count, and a resident of Billings, Montana, who watched their city break its own all-time heat record twice within the same 3-week stretch. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.